right, lecture 2 on our civil rights movement or movements unit goes into the background and early events of the African American civil rights movement. So we're going to start with that one, and then eventually once we finish that, which is the most prominent, I suppose, of them, we'll get into separate days for the American Indian movement, the Latino civil rights movement, and the women's liberation movement. So right now we're going to focus solely on the African American civil rights movement. Important to note, even though this graph is a couple of years short, that when we talk about civil rights, sometimes it gets controversial, especially when we get into protected classes or affirmative action or whatever. Important to note here that civil rights, this free, sort of equal society that we believe we live in, is only 56 years old. I know the sign there says 51, but it's a little old. 56 years old, right? For the beginning 200 years, 240 years of black life in America, there was slavery. For the next 99 years of black life in America, there was segregation. Legal segregation, separate and unequal societies. And it was only from 1964, the 1964 Civil Rights Act to be precise, from that point until now, that we've actually had a quote-unquote free and equal society. So if you imagine, and President Lyndon Baines Johnson said this, you imagine a people held behind for 300 years, 340 years at that point. 50 years isn't really that, not that much compared, right? It's 1/6 of the time that they were spent in separate and unequal conditions. So as we talk about that, and there's still issues going on, lots of issues going on when it comes in terms of civil rights and all that sort of stuff. It's because this free period is very short so far in American history. And it expands every day, and things will get better as it continues expanding, but there's still lots of fights to fight, is what I'm trying to say. So, obviously, the civil rights movement does not start when Martin Luther King decides to start marching, or when Claudette Colvin or Rosa Parks decide not to give up their bus seats, or when Ida B. Wells refuses to give up her train seat 100 years before that. That's not when the civil rights movement starts. It starts with slavery. It starts with resistance to slavery. That's the beginning of the civil rights movement. Okay? So slaves revolt, slaves try to run away, slaves break things. The Civil War eventually happens, right? The North defeats the South. It was fought over slavery, which we talked about a lot. And we know that it was fought over slavery because the southern states that seceded all said they seceded because they wanted to protect slavery, and that the North was going to take away their slaves. So, after the Civil War ends, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed to end slavery, extend citizenship to black Americans, and giving voting rights to black men. That does not mean that racism ends. Obviously, that does not mean that racism ends. Okay? Anti-black protests, anti-black racism will heighten. They'll get worse in the post-war years, during the Reconstruction years of the 1860s and 1870s. The Ku Klux Klan is formed. Jim Crow laws or black codes are passed to keep blacks segregated and excluded from voting through poll taxes and literacy tests. The goal here for the Klan, for the White Citizens Council, for other racist groups, was to make life worse than slavery for black Americans. So on the left, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Okay, on the right, some stuff from the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a federal government organization created to help newly freed slaves, which of course, being 1860s America, with a lot of political fights, was underfunded and undermanned, so of course it won't work as well as it could, but we'll get into that here in a moment. So, your first question. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed to help which group? Was it A, African Americans, B, Asian Americans, C, Native Americans, or D, white Americans? So, Reconstruction, we have talked about a bunch. Okay, we did a whole unit on it at the beginning of the war, but just to review, right, after the Civil War, we had to figure out how to put the country back together, and that's what Reconstruction was. Lincoln had his plan, which was pretty, honestly, it was pretty light in terms of punishment on the South, but of course he gets assassinated. Andrew Johnson takes office and has an even lighter touch towards the South, himself being a Southerner. That won't particularly work out. There'll be lots of fights between the president and Congress, which is where we get to radical Reconstruction. the creation of 5 military districts for the South because they weren't doing what the Congress wanted them to do, so they'll be controlled by Union troops all the way until 1877. The Freedmen's Bureau and the federal government will try and fail to secure equality for black citizens. So people cared in Washington, people didn't care so much on the actual ground to make it happen, and that conflict will lead to the failure of Reconstruction. Ultimately fails, okay, like we said, which will lead to more violence, more terror, and more segregation. Race riots in Tulsa, New Orleans, the expanded KKK winning statewide elections, lynchings, more than 4,000 African Americans will get lynched between 1865 and 1965. And we remember lynchings are extrajudicial, which means no legal process, killings of people just because they were accused of a crime, and it often was racial ethnic minorities that were singled out for this. There's a great, not really great, I should say, a tragically sad but well-made museum to the victims of lynching that was just opened last year. On the bottom left here, there's a video clip I want you to watch of Martin Luther King. I'll include it on the lectures, but he talks pretty openly about the failures of Reconstruction and how that creates the society that he himself tried to fix. On the left, Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, one of the founders of the Klan, former Confederate soldier. In the middle, the image that we have of the Klan, a bunch of idiots wearing robes and masks lighting a cross on fire. The whole lighting of a cross thing wasn't originated by the Klan. It was originated for a white supremacist movie that was made, one of the first motion pictures called Birth of a Nation, which basically blamed all bad things that ever happened in the country on black people. In that, they did the burning cross. And the Klan saw that movie and said, you know what? We should start burning crosses. So they started. On the right, this was the plan here. We got the White League on one side, which were racists that didn't wear masks. And on the right, we had the Klan, who were super racist that did wear masks. And you can see them uniting over a thing that says worse than slavery for these black families after the Civil War ends. Then we got Jim Crow laws, or black codes, that were passed to try to segregate the country. So, over here on the left, the Imperial Laundry Company only washes for white people because you can't mix together white people and non-white people's clothes, obviously. In the middle, no dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans. Colored served in the rear, restrooms for white only, drinking fountains for white or for colored. On the top right, we got the car for white folks, okay, the train car, it's real nice. Then the Jim Crow car, which is for non-white folks, being nasty. And we serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexican. So it wasn't just a black-white thing. It'll extend to the Southwest to be black versus brown, or white versus brown, I should say. But these laws were in place until the 1960s, right? So we go back to that timeline I showed you, okay? Slavery's over, right? Hooray, slavery's over. And now you get 100 years of separate and unequal conditions in our country. So the next question, true or false? Reconstruction was a success. Back-to-back questions. Jim Crow laws were put in place to were put in place to enforce, sorry, there's an extra make in there, forget about the word make. To enforce what? A, integration, B, segregation, C, equality, or D, none of the above. All right. So, one of the early events will be Plessy versus Ferguson, okay, which is an example of civil disobedience and legal action. So, Homer Plessy will get onto a white-only train car. Plessy was 1/8 black, which means he was required to sit in the colored car. He does this on purpose, okay? It's an act of planned disobedience. So what they call something like this, they call this a test case. This is trying to use the legal system to fix something that you think is wrong in the country. So at this point, they had whites-only train cars and blacks-only train cars, or I should say colored train cars, right, for anybody that's non-white. Homer Plessy didn't think this was right, so he intentionally gets onto the whites-only car, makes it known that he will not move, gets arrested, and gets jailed. His plan is to appeal this all the way to the Supreme Court to get that law overturned, the law that said it was okay to segregate. So he wants to get that taken out. So it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court, in a 7-1 ruling, says that separate but equal is cool. It's fine to have separate but equal conditions for blacks and non-black, or for whites and non-whites, for whites and colored people. Of course, things were never equal. They were separate and unequal. Very nice for white folks, very bad for colored folks. And we'll see some examples as we go. But this standard, separate but equal, will be legally the standard until the 1960s. Okay, for the next 58 years. I should say 1950s, we get Brown versus Board of Education, but it takes all the way up until the Civil Rights Act of '64 to outlaw segregation entirely. So, separate but equal. So the idea here is that if you have separate facilities for white and non-white, as long as they are equal in quality, that is okay. Of course, they were not equal in quality. So on the left, there's Homer Plessy, who doesn't look particularly dark-skinned or anything like that, which is part of the reason he had to make it known that he was on the whites-only train car. In the middle, a cartoon, but unfortunately a pretty accurate cartoon. So the white water fountain is made very clean, very nicely put together. Looks like a modern drinking fountain. On the right, for the black folks, for the non-white folks, for the colored folks, you get a nasty bucket and a hand crank to pump out some water. We can see here the Jim Crow law is upheld by the United States Supreme Court. So your next question, Plessy versus Ferguson established that segregation was okay as long as facilities were blank but blank. A, separate but similar. B, separate but unequal. C, separate but equal. Or D, separate but segregated. Oops, wrong way on that one. All right, the NAACP will be an important group still until this very day. It stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It was established in 1909. The goal here is to fight segregation, establish equal rights and equal opportunities for black people. The main route for the NAACP to do this was through the legal system. So that test case from Homer Plessy wasn't done by the NAACP, obviously, because they're founded 13 years later, but a lot of other test cases will be. So the NAACP, with prominent lawyers like Thurgood Marshall, who eventually becomes a Supreme Court justice, they will provide the legal help for people who try these test cases. They will also provide free legal help for people that are being accused of crimes with little to no evidence, trying to prevent more lynchings and stuff like that. So the NAACP is still very important, still around prominently in our country. So the NAACP was created to do what? A, fight segregation. B, establish equal rights for black people. C, establish equal rights or equal opportunities for black people. Or D, all of the above. Okay, important to remember that they used the legal system to do this as much as they could. All right, number 4, presidential leadership. Important to note, important to remember for the rest of your life is that presidents don't often do the right thing without pressure from us regular people to make them do the right thing. Okay? I'm not saying that all presidents are bad people or anything like that, but presidents aren't always motivated to do the best of things. Their advisors don't always give them the best advice. The people that pay for their campaigns want the stuff that they want. Okay? So not all presidents are going to support the right stuff. Not all presidents are going to support the civil rights movement. Okay? Obviously, Lincoln was great. Lincoln eventually came around to supporting it after being anti-civil rights initially. But then we'll have a bunch of bad presidents in between. Some okay ones, some bad ones. President Wilson's going to be real bad. He's going to resegregate the federal government in 1912. He's going to play that racist Birth of a Nation movie at the White House and talk about how great it is. So some presidents better than that. Teddy Roosevelt was pretty good. FDR had his moments, although he'll let a lot of his benefits not affect black people in order to secure racist votes from the Southern Democratic Party. But President Truman, now they're up into the 40s and 50s and 60s, President Truman will be one of the better ones. Okay, he will desegregate the Army in 1946 to lots of angry people, but it was the right thing to do, right? You can see here on the right this clipping, right? President Truman wipes out segregation in armed forces. And then the next headline is that a posse bent on lynching searches woods for prey. So that's America there in a nutshell. Through public pressure and protest, other presidents will be brought along to help the movement. From about Truman on, you're not going to have any presidents that, well, very rarely will presidents be openly against civil rights legislation, right? Doesn't mean they're all super on board, but they'll be more on board than the presidents had been before Truman. So true or false? Protest and pressure forced many presidents to support the civil rights movement. Okay, is that true or is that false? All right. Number 5, breaking the color barrier in sports. This will be an early event. This will be a big game. So, we had segregated sports leagues. Obviously, it was America during this time period. America had segregated everything else, so they're going to segregate sports as well. We had the major leagues. Major League Baseball was just for white players. So we had a separate Negro League. Right? It was the same basically in every sport. So, Jackie Robinson will be the first professional black athlete to break the color barrier. Okay, he'll be the first black player in Major League Baseball. He will end up being fantastic at baseball, right? He was an MVP, multiple-time champion, future Hall of Famer. At this point right now, they have Jackie Robinson Day in baseball, where every single player wears his number 42. No other time can anyone wear number 42 because his contribution to the game and to the world at large was so good or so big that they retired his number in every team. No team lets people wear number 42 except for on his day. Other famous Olympians, Jesse Owens. He was not the first black Olympian. That was John Taylor in 1908. But he will win 4 gold medals at the 1936 Berlin Olympics right in front of Hitler. Thumbing his nose as Hitler. Jesse Owens, his parents were sharecroppers that escaped the South. They moved north during the Great Migration, and he'll end up becoming one of our most important athletes ever. The first black athlete to be a national hero was Jesse Owens. Althea Gibson was the first African-American female professional tennis and golfer. Okay, she won 11 Grand Slam championships in tennis. That's really, really hard to do. Kenny Washington, the first black professional football player. So we'll go through them here. We got Jackie Robinson on the left for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Right before the Dodgers moved to LA, they were the Brooklyn Dodgers. Got Jesse Owens, Althea Gibson, okay, and then Kenny Washington as well on there. We'll have more here. See here, Texas Western men's basketball team. Famous, what's the name? Glory Road, I think is the name of the movie they made about them. But they'll win the NCAA tournament by starting 5 black players in 1965. At this point, still a lot of colleges don't accept black players or black students. Obviously, a lot of college sporting teams don't allow black athletes or don't give scholarships out. Texas Western will start 5 black players, and they'll only play the 5 black players in the championship game against Kentucky, who was notoriously under their coach Adolph Rupp refused to recruit any black athletes at that time, and they'll eventually win it, which was a huge moment for the civil rights movement. So, Charles Sifford will be the first professional black male golfer in 1952. Tiger Woods eventually will take the reins as the best golfer maybe ever. But he'll be the first black golfer to win the Masters. He's second all-time in major titles, just won the Masters again last year in a crazy sort of comeback story. Jack Johnson will be the first black heavyweight boxing champion in the world in 1908. Wasn't a lot of fights for him in America because they wouldn't really sanction him fighting against white boxers in America, so he had to fight a lot abroad, but I'll show you a picture of him in a minute. He was a big, tough dude. Willie O'Ree became the first black professional hockey player in 1957, and Earl Lloyd will become the first black professional basketball player in the NBA in 1950. So Texas Western and Jack Johnson right there in the middle. At this point, boxing wasn't like how it is now. If you turn on ESPN or whatever, people dodge and move and try to avoid getting punched in the face. Back then, it was you just get punched in the face until you collapse. So if you ever look at some colorized photos from boxing back then, it is horrifying. Just blood everywhere, people just completely messed up. But he was one of the best at it, and he was super loud and in your face about it, which was awesome because no one was tough enough to try to stand up to him. Charles Sifford there in the second to right, and then Earl Lloyd on the far right. All right, Emmett Till. I'll attach an Emmett Till video here as well. The Emmett Till story is a very famous, tragic story about a 14-year-old African-American boy who will get lynched in Mississippi. Okay, his name was Emmett Till. He was sent down there to hang out with some of his cousins and his uncles and stuff like that in the summer when he was out of school. One of the first things that they do, they go to a local store to buy some candy and do all this sort of stuff because he's a kid. He flirts at or whistles at a white woman who was at the store, who was working at the store. Okay, his friends told him that was stupid. They shouldn't have done that. They should run home. Eventually, they do go home, but That night, that woman's husband and that woman's brother will go find Emmett Till, and they will brutally murder Emmett Till just because he whistled at this woman, allegedly. They beat him until he was nearly dead. They gouged out one of his eyes. Then they shot him in the back of the head, and they threw his body into a river. Again, I put the wrong "through" on there. They tied to his body, they tied a fan, this industrial fan that was very heavy, to try to drag his body to the bottom of the river. Though that didn't work, his body eventually floats up. His body's going to be basically unrecognizable because they beat him so bad. But his mother will say that she won't let this just stand. She holds an open casket funeral to show the world what actually had happened, what was continuing to happen in America at this time period. So she does that. She makes a big stink. She's able to recognize her son's body based on a ring that she had given him that he was wearing, and some other things that because she was mom, she knew him well enough to identify. The two men, the husband and the brother, were put on trial, and surprise, surprise, were found not guilty. It wasn't a particularly long trial. It wasn't. The deliberations weren't very long, right, before they find the two men not guilty. Many Southern newspapers and legislators argued that there were no actual race problems in the South. Okay, there were no issues down here, despite the fact that a couple of jerks, since I don't want to swear right now, decided to kill a little kid because he whistled at the wrong woman or something. There's no race problems in the South at this point. There was just black people bringing crime down to the South, so they had to be handled if they brought it down to the South. And you know what? Honestly, we should worry about black crime in the cities and not worry about racism or lynchings in the South. Before I flip it to the next picture, the pictures are going to be of the open casket funeral. So if you are squeamish, if you don't want to see this, now is your time to skip ahead. I don't know, 15 or 20 seconds, so you don't have to see it. But there's your warning. So on the left, you see that's what Emmett Till looked like when he left for Mississippi, and then that's what he looks like in the middle when they got done killing him. On the right, 2 Mississippians acquitted in slaying of Chicago Negro. The jurors were only out 67 minutes, so the jurors knew they were going to find him not guilty, so they went in the back and hung out for an hour to try to make it look like they were actually deliberating on it. All right, so lynchings. Lynchings we've talked about in this class. We've done the Monroe Work Today activity, but lynchings are defined as public murders of a suspected criminal carried out without a trial. So they accuse somebody of doing something bad, of stealing or of improper relations, because at this point it wasn't legal for black people and white people to have intimate relations. So they'd accuse them of that. Oftentimes, probably the biggest accusation was they'd accuse a black man of raping a white woman, even though there was very little instances, much fewer instances of that than they reported and all that sort of stuff. But you get accused of it, and instead of waiting to have a trial, they'll just kill you. So after Reconstruction's lynchings of black people became extremely common in America. The purpose here was to terrorize black people and to maintain white dominance. Many white Southerners believed that black people had to be controlled by fear and threats of violence. So like I said, between 1877, between Reconstruction and 1950, more than 4,000 black people were lynched. They were lynched in all but 4 states. The vast majority in the South, but it happens all over the country. Like I said, blacks were lynched for all sorts of reasons: for trying to vote, for acting uppity or acting like they were equal to white people, to disrespect white people, including things like not getting out of their way when they're walking towards you on a sidewalk, not calling them sir or ma'am or whatever, flirting with white women, having relations with white women, or just because they were successful. There are numerous stories of black people that through all this were able to persevere and have success that were killed because of that. Lynchings became social affairs, with hundreds gathering to watch. So I'll give you another little warning here. There's going to be pictures of lynchings coming up here on the next couple of slides. Another quick thing to remember is that basically every person that's in charge in our country, governors, the president, the vice president, most people in Congress, were alive and cognizant during this time period. They knew that stuff like this happened, right? President Trump's in his late 70s. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, I think just turned 80. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, he's in his 70s. So they were all alive during this time period, right? It's important to know it's not ancient history. So on the left, you see black guy getting lynched. You see hundreds of people there to be a part of it. They would take pictures of lynchings and turn them into postcards. People would cut pieces off of lynched individuals to keep as souvenirs. And this isn't that long ago. This is 70 years ago. We see here on a thing right here, Negro is lynched by Missouri crowd. Suspected of attacking a white woman, right? Was then pulled out of jail. When they say attacking a white woman, they mean rape. Was pulled out of jail and hanged for that. There was no such thing as a consensual relationship between a black man and a white woman until the 60s, 70s in different parts of America. So, between 1877 and 1950, about how many African Americans were lynched? 100, 400, 1,000, or 4,000? A, B, C, or D? Redlining. Redlining is a very, very, very important thing to understand because it helps explain a lot of the issues we have right now in America in terms of race. So, redlining is the name for a policy created by the Federal Housing Authority. So, after or during World War, the interwar period, we created this housing authority to control like interest rates and help provide loans that are insured by the federal government and all sorts of things. However, the Federal Housing Authority would not insure loans for black people or people of color. They would only insure loans for white Americans, right? Furthermore than that, not only did they refuse to insure loans for black lenders or lenders of color, they also started color-coding areas for development, okay? What that means is they would take a map of a city, like here's Baltimore, and they would code it, right? So they'd have different colors, right? They'd have yellow, they'd have green, they'd have red. Red meant that it was a majority-minority area, which means they would not insure loans in that area. They would insure housing loans, and in a lot of places would insure business loans in those areas, right? Those happen to be the areas that we would allow, we kind of force, push. We talked about, we were talking about the Great Migration, we talked about the Harlem Renaissance, right? Big reason the Harlem Renaissance happened in Harlem is that that was the only place that we would allow black people to live really in New York. They were kind of forced into that area. So here's Baltimore, right? They're forced into that area, then they color-code it red, and they say no loans for people in that area. Okay? This means, because they're denied guaranteed loans, quality affordable housing, and most businesses won't build that, right? Which means not only are people just renting, and they're renting bad apartments, but they're renting bad apartments in areas that don't have businesses to employ them, don't have as much like grocery stores, what we call food deserts. They have places that don't have fresh produce there for them to purchase and stuff like that. So it leads to cycles of poverty and high crime rates, right? It leads to all the social problems that we talk about. So by denying black people and people of color home ownership, the FHA will basically deny their chances to move up and to access the middle class. So for example, right, we've talked about the growth in the suburbs, okay? One of those big things we call Levitt towns or whatever, right? That were built by a guy by the name of Levitt. So the suburbs did not allow black people or people of color to buy homes, right? So only white people bought those homes. So maybe they bought a house in the 1960s, a white family, for like $5,000. And now you move on to 2020, 70 years later or whatever, that house is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and they own it because they paid off their mortgage or whatever, right? So now they have hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of wealth in that property. At the same time, a family of color, a black family, could not buy a house. So they had to rent for those 70 years, right? Or whatever, or say 50 of those 70 years. So they don't have that wealth because you don't get any equity, you don't build any wealth when you're renting. Then, like I said, in these redlined areas, businesses flee, so there's less economic opportunities, which tend to lead to crime increasing, because that is seen as your opportunity to make money, because there's not businesses here to employ you or whatever, right? So that's going to lead to a lot of the problems we have today with issues in inner city Baltimore. To this day, that redlined area there in Baltimore is the most dangerous part of Baltimore, the part with the highest dropout rates and the highest gang activity and the highest rates of drug abuse. And it's been a historical problem. It didn't start 20 years ago or 30 years ago. It started 70 or 80 or 90 years ago, maybe even 100 years ago, where we only allowed these people to move into certain places, and then we removed all the positives out of those places. I shouldn't say removed. We allowed those positives to leave those places, I should say. So What is redlining? Is it A, a federal policy regarding home loans? Is it B, color coding areas based on race? C, denying guaranteed home loans and adequate housing based on race? C, a policy that resulted in the denial of upward mobility for many black families? Or is it E, all of the above? All right, going along with redlining is an idea called white flight. White flight is a term that refers to when white people left cities and moved to suburbs. Okay? They did this, or a lot of white people, I should say, did this because more and more black people were moving into the cities, more and more non-white people were moving into the cities. We start redlining those communities that they move into, and a lot of white people decide, you know what, maybe I don't want to live in this kind of cramped city-like condition. I obviously don't want to live in these redlined areas, so I'm going to move further away to the suburbs. So basically leaving the cities, fleeing to the suburbs. Remember, in the suburbs, we had housing covenants, we had restrictions on who could buy property and stuff like that, which meant in the suburbs, it was all white. So as white people left the cities, their businesses generally followed with them, which creates economic problems in inner city communities, which leads directly to increased crime, gang, and drug activity. White suburban communities often discriminated, like I just said, through housing covenants or other different ordinances that they would pass to not allow black people to move there. If, say, maybe you did move into one of those communities, maybe you bought a house, people would bomb your house in the middle of suburban America. 1968, the government commissioned what they called the Kerner Commission, which had a much longer name, but what's important is they released a report. That report blamed social and racial unrest on segregation created by white flight. Okay, in 1968, we had a lot of riots, and so they formed this commission to study why we had these riots. And what they said was that our nation was moving towards two societies, one black and one white, separate and unequal. They said unless conditions were remedied, the commission warned that the country faced a system of apartheid in major cities, which means extreme segregation, which means nice for the white community and extremely bad for the non-white community. And this is in 1968 that they're issuing this report. And we will see in the late 60s, throughout the 70s, up until the 92 race riot, up until different protest movements here with the Black Lives Matter movement and all sorts of stuff in the last 5 or 10 years, that we didn't really listen to this report, right? That we continue to move towards a separate, unequal style society, unfortunately, and that we still have racial unrest because of it. So, examples here with white flight. On the right, you can see a Levittown built up, and we have signs in front of it that say we want white tenants in our white community. So through a whole bunch of different racist laws, they kept black and brown, non-white people, they kept them out of these communities. So what is white flight? Is it A, when white people moved out of cities to the suburbs to avoid living near minorities? Is it B, a major airline during the 1950s? C, when white people moved into the cities to live closer to minorities? Or D, white response to the civil rights movement? All right, a few recommendations for you while we're here quarantined or just in general. There are some great books on the civil rights movement. To understand the background of it, I would recommend Bind Us Apart and The Color of Law. The Color of Law is very specific on